Hi everyone, welcome to Burnt Out in GLAM World, how to build resilience in survival mode. And we are broadening our typical LAM discussion to include galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. So we will get into it. If you haven't met me before, I am Rachel Woody. I am a business owner, author, speaker, educator, advocate, and consultant. I have been growing my business, Rachel Christine Consulting, for about 5.5 years now. And I've had 15 plus years in archives, museums, and cultural heritage institutions of all shapes and sizes. And I've done quite a bit of service work, the most recent including serving on the ARC's Advocacy Committee, and I have served on SAA's Committee on Public Awareness and the Salary Ad Hoc Committee, as well as being a co-founder and funder of the Northwest Archivist in Residence program. A little bit of housekeeping before we get into it. A link to this recording and links to all the resources that we mention or talk about today will be sent via email to everybody who registered. You will get that email about 24 hours after the premiere of the webinar. And then as we go along, if you're following the premiere live, we will be putting the links that we discuss in the chat box. This session is pre-recorded so that I can deliver the maximum amount of information possible, and we can then have discussion and follow-up questions in the chat box as we go. Speaking of the chat box, please feel free to share your own examples, resources, links, etc. in the chat box, but you will need to have a YouTube sign-in account in order to use the chat because it is a YouTube provided chat box, and it's a security precaution to make sure that only appropriate content makes it in there. And then please just remember and respect that the content in this webinar is my own intellectual property and subject to copyright. If I am referencing other sources, there will be a very obvious link and mention of where I gathered that information. Also, whether you're in the webinar room or over on YouTube, this is a YouTube provided video. So if your screen's a little small and you want to make it full screen, you have that option and availability. Also, there is closed captioning available for this webinar. We have a somewhat typical disclaimer. I am not an HR expert, legal expert, or medical expert. So any sort of laws or policies are going to be specific to your geographic location and your organization. What I am sharing here is from my own experiences and from my own frame of reference. And somewhat unusual, we do have a bit of a trigger warning for this webinar, as this particular topic has impact on physical and mental health. Today's content is going to include the mention and light discussion of trauma, self-harm, and suicide. All right, our outline for today. We will have a brief definition of what burnout is so that we're all working from the same frame of reference. We will get into the causes of burnout and what that looks like, which naturally leads in, unfortunately, to a discussion of why galleries, libraries, archives, and museums are so awful, or essentially why so many of us are burnt out in this field. We will cover how burnout takes a toll. It can be hard when you're in it to really see the impact of what is happening in the other areas of your life. And so I think it's important for us to list out all of the impacts that can be happening so that we're aware of and to the best of our ability can hopefully mitigate. And for longer term mitigation, we will be talking about some short-term strategies for surviving this intense period of time, and then longer term strategies for surviving, which ultimately is the hope of getting you completely out of this situation and feeling better. We will then, of course, naturally, and as will become apparent in the content we cover, have a discussion on what GLAM managers should be doing to help combat and eliminate burnout happening for their staff. So we'll be discussing why it's up to the managers due to power dynamics and infrastructure, and what it is that they can do. So if you are a manager, you have some takeaways and action items. And if you are not a manager, you are certainly under one. So you can perhaps leave that slide on their desk for some helpful hints. We do have some questions. Most of them I've sprinkled throughout to make sure that we're addressing everything, but we will also have a question answer period at the end of this presentation to close out any of the question discussion that we're having in the chat. Definition of burnout. So burnout is basically the chronic stress that is specific to the workplace. So the stress and subsequent burnout, the origination source and perpetual source is workplace. It is persistent in the physical and emotional exhaustion that it causes. You can rarely or never feel well rested while in this state. And as a result, it presents with other comorbidities, including anxiety, depression, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and substance abuse. So what causes burnout? This particular slide, this slide and the next slide are informed by the Mayo Clinic with the link on the bottom of this slide. And I'm going to use informed by with this source and one of the others that we use for our discussion. While it has some very helpful information, it also, I think, is incorrectly focusing on solely what it is we can do as people to sort of self-care ourselves out of burnout, which in my opinion is impossible. There are certainly things that we can do, but the assumption that we solely are the ones that can get ourselves out of it is, I think, incorrect. So I have adapted and added detail to some of these things. I've also done some correction and clarity work for these bullet points. So just know that if you're going to go check out the Mayo Clinic, you may see some somewhat different information, and that is the reason why I've done some of the adjustments here. So with that caveat stated, what causes burnout? First of all, lack of control, an inability to influence decisions that affect your job and therefore affect you, such as your schedule, assignments, or workload. In particular, especially with pandemic crises, etc., the ability to do remote work, work from home, determining that schedule has been increasingly stripped away from GLAM workers with this return to work attitude and policies or lack of policies. So lack of control of where it is you work, how you work, what your workload is, etc. Next one is lack of resources. So an insufficient amount of resources you need to do your work. This could be additional staff for projects. This could be like physical supplies to work on projects. This could be software tools, digitization equipment, anything that would help make your job easier, better, more efficient, more accurate. All of those are considered resources. And for so many of GLAM organizations, there's just never enough of the right resources. Unclear job expectations are the next one. And this means specifically that you're unclear about the degree of authority that you may have or autonomy over your job, or what your supervisor and others may expect from you. So sort of that guessing game of what does it mean or look like for you actually to be successful, and having sort of a vacuum of no feedback or affirmations. Which gets us into our next one. There's either zero feedback, late feedback, or only negative feedback happening. When feedback on how you're performing is withheld or is limited or is only ever done in a, like, here's only the negative with no constructive feedback given, then it's only serving to completely tear you down with no tools to actually do better or navigate out of that. So you have very little idea of what success could look like, let alone how you could get there. And continuing, dysfunctional workplace dynamics is the next one. The existence of office bullies or manipulators. You feel undermined by colleagues or your boss, and your boss being hypercritical and micromanages your work. So those are a variety of flavors of dysfunction, and you may have all or just a few of these, but even just one of these present is enough to create a toxic work environment that causes burnout for everyone, including the toxic people. Next one, extremes of activity and imbalance. So when a job is monotonous, chaotic, or it's an unreasonable amount of work, which for us, we're usually in that third category, it means you're overworked and you need constant energy to remain focused and to try and get through that overwhelming amount of work. And then lack of social support. So you feel isolated at work and experience little to no support from your boss or colleagues. And as amazing as our partners, family, and friends can be, when you are experiencing workplace burnout, there's only so much that they can do to help shore you up. So, having that support at work with somebody experiencing similar dysfunction can help in terms of forming affinity and at least combating that isolation of at least you're not alone or the only person feeling this way. So, why are GLAMs so awful? Why is it that our field is experiencing this? And as can be seen from a lot of the statistics, the great resignation is happening everywhere, but even more so in the galleries, libraries, archives, and museum world. A lot of people are moving jobs, and more specifically for our field, a lot of people are leaving the field entirely. So no longer moving just from like one museum to the other, but like completely leaving the field for an entirely different job, which should be alarming for all of us, as we are losing all of those wonderful brains that could be contributing to the work that we're doing, as well as emotionally losing all of those valued colleagues. So we are going to experience a severe brain drain and perhaps eventually staff shortages if we don't change something in terms of how the health of our field. So, why are they so awful? It essentially is taking real world problems, so all of the global crises that we have recently and are currently undergoing, and we are putting on top of that the crises of our field, which our field has had some chronic crises with just perpetually underfunded, which only ever seems to get worse and never better. And in addition to that, how those existing crises have just been exacerbated due to the global crises. So we have some compounding effects here of always a crisis situation, leading to so many of us being burnt out. And specifically for GLAMs, while this can be true anywhere, I have found it to be the most true in the nonprofit sector, where poorly trained people are managing people that they should never be managing. Like they have never received business training or managing people training, and they are more subject matter specialists who have been graduated upwards based on their subject specialty achievements and not on their people management achievements. So they've never acquired the knowledge to do that. They've never acquired the experience to do that. And so are ill-equipped to actually successfully manage people by the time they make it up into management ranks. Nor do those people tend to seek out additional education on how they can manage people, because there's usually a bit of ego involved. So if you are a manager who has never received training before, you should go and get yourself some. Next, lack of resources to maintain reasonable staffing levels for work assigned, and administration irresponsibly requiring their staff to overwork to make up for the lack in staffing resources. So we are all in this field because we love it, and that has unfortunately been weaponized against us in this regard. The dynamic that typically exists here is, we all need to pitch in, other gaslighting euphemisms here, in order to make up for not being able to afford that extra FTE. And as we've been chipping away at the resources available to GLAMs, there has only ever been an addition of work and a combination of positions, to the point where I am regularly working with clients where the people there are doing a minimum of 3 FTE jobs as one FTE person, which is just mind-boggling and impossible. It's impossible to be successful when you have more than one job. So unfortunately, instead of administration making different decisions and scoping work appropriately based on resources available, they are instead passing that responsibility and that sacrifice essentially to their employees. And to get into this point a little bit more, the use of gaslighting and other emotionally manipulative tactics that are meant to shame you into compliance. I'm not saying that managers necessarily know that that is what they're doing. I hope that the majority of them aren't maliciously and knowingly doing this, but the majority of them, this is the effect of not solving the problem and putting it on you, and using phrases like "we should all pitch in around here" or "be a good girl" kind of things to just get you to do the work without them taking on any responsibility of this completely unreasonable situation and ask. So the end result being making you the bad guy if you are trying to have boundaries, or you're trying to say no, and you're trying to be more wise with the little bit of time and energy you do have. So all of that is occurring here on top of the lack of resources. And with the lack of resources to offer living wages, let alone competitive market rate wages, and poor or no benefit offerings to help with staff well-being. So not only are GLAMs asking us to do more work, 3 times plus as much work, not only are they making us feel bad emotionally if we are trying to have boundaries or make work more reasonable, they're also then not even paying us for that 1 FTE job, let alone the 3 FTE jobs you may be doing. So all of this is compounding, making us feel completely awful and having little to show for it in terms of at least financial recompense. How burnout takes a toll. So this slide is informed by the Henry Ford Health Center. So link at the bottom of the slide, and we'll put it in the chat for you. Similar caveat to the Mayo Clinic, where the information here is helpful, but it is lacking, in my opinion, a fuller context of what it actually needs to change, which is that systematic infrastructure change and the change that you're probably not able to make as an employee. So, how burnout takes a toll. Excessive ingest of food, alcohol, and drugs to numb or alter your mood. Persistent physical and mental overwhelm and fatigue. The exacerbation and onset of physical ailments and autoimmune diseases. the increase or onset of chronic pain issues or other physical disabilities, anxiety, panic attacks, moodiness, and irritability, and a re-triggering of past trauma and or the formation of new trauma. Given the intense amount of stress from putting too much work on you, given the long and sustained periods of that stress, given the lack of resources, support, or even acknowledgement of the situation and that burden of stress, and on top of that, any of the other sort of gaslighting or emotional manipulation happening to get you to do that work perpetually, all of that compounding is having an effect on your body. It's having an effect on your brain, your mental and emotional well-being as well. And while our bodies and brains can undergo quite a bit, at some point when you're in this type of situation, you can only take it on for so long before your body and brain will start to attempt to shut you down. And what I mean by that, and with my own personal experience to share with you here, is that your body will try and shut you down to help you survive. And what that looked like for me was the onset of chronic pain issues that got so bad that I was in pain, severe 9 to 10 levels of pain almost every day. And with that caused even further anxiety and depression with experiencing chronic pain on top of chronic stress. It got to the point where I was so overwhelmed and so stressed that it was hard for me to even know how I felt. Like the feelings themselves were numb. And so when I started experiencing extreme panic attacks, they were seemingly about nothing. I would all of a sudden get a panic attack and wonder like nothing had happened, nothing was said. It seemed like such a mystery, but it was really just my body and mind reaching a point of such overwhelm and such sustained pain that it was giving me a panic attack to try and shut me down so that I could rest and rejuvenate. And with all of this, with the depression, with the pain, it just will continue to compound for you until something changes. And if that doesn't come soon enough, your body and mind is going to start making those decisions and changes for you without you realizing. So if you've experienced any of this, or have started to experience and have wondered what the heck is going on, I'm just a little stressed, that is what is happening here. Stress can cause all of these things for our bodies and our minds. So it's important to pay attention to that happening. And I'm warning you now that that is an indication of how much longer your body and mind may have before it completely shuts you down. So my hope for you is that you don't get to that point before you can remove yourself from this awful situation causing this burnout. Burnout is just, it's not just this superficial temporary situation. It is very real, and it has some very real, awful, and long-term consequences if nothing is done to help mitigate it. To continue, you will also feel inability to make decisions in any setting, not just work. There's a bit of a mental petrification, for lack of a better word. And this could be down to mental fog, or it could be down from just the extreme anxiety of having to deal with anything. You can't even think your way straight through a decision. With that, loss of motivation to perform any tasks, and this is true both at work and at home. So what will start out as a work specific onset of burnout is going to permeate throughout all areas of your life. There will be experience of chronic depression, self-harm, and suicidal thoughts. Even if you are feeling numb or think you are feeling numb, you have an inability to register emotions, that is perhaps when you should be the most worried. And that for me was when the onset of the self harm and suicidal thoughts came into play. So do please pay attention to that and realize how serious that can be, even if you think you're just stressed or even if you don't think you're feeling much of anything. With this, and of course, as is true for depression in general, withdrawing from support systems, canceling plans, and being resistant to therapeutic work are all symptoms of this getting to a urgent level of threat for how your body and mind are doing. For me specifically, even though mental health therapy can be such a great tool, the work that has to go into it, especially when you're in this awful place already, it can be hard to feel like you have any energy left to even feel these emotions or feel this burnout even more. So, when you perhaps need therapy the most is when it is the hardest to actually go out and get for yourself. And sleep deprivation, insomnia, nightmares, or excessive sleep, but without achieving any full rest. So, as you can see, burnout is quite serious and can get to a point where it can have permanent detrimental effects. So let's get into some strategies here. I have some short-term strategies to offer, and then we'll have a few long-term strategies to take a look at. The essential note here is that we need more than self-care. While all of these do constitute self-care, I want to just acknowledge that a lot of the articles out there right now about burnout, about quiet quitting, while are well intentioned, they are not responsibly getting into any of the underlying psychology or psychological warfare that exists to cause burnout, as well as how it is so integrated into the infrastructure of how we typically work that there's very little that we can do as people to help get us out of that bad situation, to help pull us out of that burnout feeling. So I do want us to get into some concrete strategies with the eye of looking towards that long term, let's get you out of that situation. So, deaccession as much as possible. To use a term familiar in archives and museums world, deaccession is the intentional removal of items from a collection because it is not a thematic fit to the collecting policy. And so what I am proposing here is that you treat your life like that as well. And in a work setting in particular, because we are given so much more work than it is just our job, I am suggesting that you deaccession as much as possible off of your plate, off of your responsibility list, especially in that work setting. Next, build rock hard boundaries. This takes practice, but building up boundaries to help protect you from or insulate you from a lot of the toxic behaviors that could be happening in your workplace. And this can definitely require the help of a therapist in terms of recognizing where boundaries should be and what they should look like. So if you need help around that, I definitely recommend a mental health therapist. Next one, continue being awesome at your job, but only perform your actual and within reason duties. So perhaps contrary to that quiet quitting phenomenon, the point is you can still be good at your job, you can still care about your job, but I want you to pull back a little bit with that deaccessioning, with that buildup of boundaries, and re-examine and recommit to what actually makes sense for your job, what is it on paper for your position description? And because so many of our position descriptions can be ridiculous and be 3 jobs worth, I want you to pare it down to what one FTE can cover. With your one FTE's worth of time, what activities and responsibilities is reasonable for you to take on? And I want you to make that an intentional decision. And I recommend further that you actually communicate that decision to your boss, whether or not they're supportive. I hope that you're in the supportive boss camp, but I know too many of us have been in the other camp. Next one, find pockets of support in or adjacent to your department. So I had mentioned that you can have as supportive partner, friends, family, but they unfortunately can only go so far, especially with this particular um, threat, essentially with burnout. You also need support in your work environment. And so sometimes that can look like fellow colleagues in your department. Sometimes that can look like a colleague that's in a different department or a mentor in the field. And sometimes that can look like colleagues who are in the field but not in your organization at all, but is a friendly ear and is at least aware of some of the complete dysfunction that is happening in the field in general. Also, know your options for short-term relief. So sick time, days off, if you have those benefits available to you, making sure that you are taking those and spreading them out in ways to provide you regular and quite periodic relief. Sometimes this can look like you take every Friday off in the summer, for example, or perhaps you save it all up because you just need to take 2 full weeks off from being at your job. So whichever works best for your brain and body, use the bit of tools or benefits you have available to put in those short-term relief areas. Next one, cultivate resilience with deep rest, therapy, and restorative activities. Specifically, what I mean by this one, and to share more of my own personal experience, my therapist framed it in regard to there is the typical adage of work hard, play hard. And we're all too exhausted to play hard. So, what it should really be is if you are working hard, then you should be resting hard. And so, the concept of what does hard rest or deep rest look like? Because rest is what our bodies and minds need when going through burnout. So, as much as you can, cultivating and providing yourself that space for sleep or just not work activities. Mental health therapy, absolutely. I have benefited so much from going to mental health therapy in so many regards, but in particular for this issue, the burnout issue, knowing that it can lead to anxiety and depression, autoimmune diseases, chronic pain, and even to suicidal thoughts, it is so important that you have a medical health professional who can help you navigate quite a bit of at least the mental and emotional component of that. And the idea of restorative activities. So again, it's not play hard. If you have the energy and want to play hard, like by all means, I'm not saying don't do that, but it is so important that you're doing that rest and that restorative activity. And so for me, and with my things going on and with my particular brand of anxiety and neurodivergence, I need to have activities that are mindless, but that keep my hands busy. Otherwise, my hands want to do self-harm. And so when I rest, my brain has a hard time being in rest mode, and that's where it goes. It goes to self-harm, which I am working on. And so having activities for me, that looks like things that keep my hands busy and my brain at least engaged enough passively that it's going to short circuit that anxiety trigger. So it looks like puzzles. I'm not a huge fan of puzzles, and yet I'm doing a lot of them. It looks like paint by numbers. I am not an artist, but I can do paint by numbers. Keeping my hands busy and using my brain just enough to short circuit that anxiety so that I can actually get rest. And finally, start to build yourself an off ramp. You need an escape plan. In order for any of these short term strategies to be as effective, you do have to eventually get the heck out of where you are. So start to think about what that looks like, start working towards that, whether that's an investment in yourself, applying for other jobs, getting out of the field entirely. Build that off ramp for yourself. So just to underscore again, in order for short-term relief efforts to have maximum impact, you have to have the end in sight. So getting into long-term strategies for surviving. First, I encourage you to know and print out your HR policies and what they are regarding reasonable accommodation, paid time off or PTO, and short-term disability. As an asterisk, I recommend you print them off because some institutions and nonprofits have been known to change those on the fly and pretend that they have always been that way. So print them out. Also get to know them, because as you start going through this and as your body and mind are struggling, you need to know what your rights are in terms of what reasonable accommodations are from an ADA perspective, how much PTO or sick time you can take off if that's paid, if you have the option of taking it unpaid if necessary. And for short-term disability, for organizations that are large enough to have this as an option, check out what your options are in terms of if it is paid or unpaid. In fact, just to back up for a little bit, I think short-term disability is available in every state, but it varies as to what that looks like. And at your organization, it will vary as to whether or not that is paid short-term disability. For myself, I went on short-term disability from one of my traditional employment jobs because my health had deteriorated that much. As you heard, there was quite a smorgasbord of ailments one could choose from. When I was filing for short-term disability, they would only allow me to pick one ailment to put forward for someone else to judge if it was bad enough. And as a tip, I guess, from learning, going through that experience, my anxiety was actually more convincing as a debilitating ailment than my documented chronic pain. So it doesn't make sense, but that was the structure and that's what I learned. So if you're to that point in considering that, hopefully that little kernel of knowledge is helpful. And also, just before I move on, short-term disability can have such a stigma to it. Organizations and HR especially, at least in my experience, was set up to dissuade and shame people from taking short-term disability, which is supposed to be a benefit offered and to be used when needed. So I'm saying if you need it, that is enough. And just know that you may receive some of that as backlash. And it is unfortunate and highly unethical, but we're in a toxic situation here, especially if you're experiencing burnout. I do not anticipate your HR department or your boss handling a short-term disability request with any sort of grace, let alone support. Second, you will need to get the fuck out of there. So if you are feeling burnout, if it is impacting your health, you you will need to leave. Um, you could leave for a just for now job, like a job at a mall or retail situation, for example. There's no shame in getting a just for now job if you need it. You could also similarly do like a lateral job move, like it may not be a perceived um, position upgrade, so to speak. There's no shame in that either. Sometimes you just need to change your scenery, or it could be a complete career change. And for us in the field, we are here because we love it, for better or worse. And it can be so difficult emotionally to get to a point where we feel okay leaving the field. And that is compounded when we have student loan debt still from education required to get us into this field. That is something that I struggled with before, when I was still in traditional employment. And I know many of our colleagues are struggling with that now. And that's all to say, you're definitely not alone. And there is no shame for you leaving this field because it is unhealthy. And just to continue any of the restorative practices that you have put into place, continue using those moving forward to help that improvement of your emotional, mental, and physical well-being. Strategies I didn't include, and I want to highlight these because they are just as important. I did not include a strategy for you to talk to your boss. In my experience, the majority of the time is that the boss is part of the problem. So, speaking with your boss about your needs, especially on like the mental emotional side, I have yet to hear a good supportive story about a boss handling that well, unfortunately. I also did not include speaking with human resources. Also, in my experience, they were the worst in terms of they're supposed to be there to support the employees, but instead, what I found was they were there to minimize the amount of what I could potentially cost them by taking some time off or by applying for short term disability. HR is not incentivized to help you feel better, even though you would think that is their job. And so, while I would definitely recommend you do some research and gather the HR resources available to you, I did not find it helpful at all to speak with HR. And in fact, that is one of the final reasons as to why I did leave my last job, was how awful and unethical the human resources manager was. I did not include trying to stick it out. So many of us, because we do love this field so much and the work, we have such well-meaning and big hearts, and this is where it's a downfall for us. This is where it's a liability. We think we can stick it out, we think it might get better, and whether it's fear of change or trying to still be loyal, either way, we can't. There is little statistical evidence that your organization is going to have any sort of meaningful change in the amount of time that you need it to happen. So please do not be disillusioned and think otherwise. Finally, I did not include trying to make organizational change. If you are not a manager, if you have no power or influence in the hierarchical dynamic that is our museums, libraries, archives, and galleries, you are not going to be able to make much meaningful change in the amount of time that you're going to need it. So I applaud you if you do try and make things better for your fellow colleagues, but that is not your job. That is not your responsibility. And if you are already not well, then your efficacy is not going to be high. So please do not try and stick it out and try and make that change. I've inserted a little Q&A here to lead us into sort of the final portion of our webinar, which is about the manager's responsibility. And the question that came in essentially was, is burnout indicative of an organizational problem versus individual one? Or is burnout and the subsequent recovery from burnout the responsibility of the employee? My short answer is that any substantive and permanent change will have to be made at the organization level. So, in order for any difference to occur, in order for burnout to stop happening or lessen, that is the organization's responsibility because it's the organization's problem. Burnout is what happens to employees in an unhealthy work environment. It is not on the employee in terms of whether or not it happened to them. That is not their responsibility. To some degree, it is on each of us to try and get better, but more so, that responsibility should reside with the organization. So, what should managers do? If you are a manager in any capacity, please pay attention to this section. If you are not a manager in any capacity and have a manager, maybe sort of suggest this webinar starting at this specific timestamp to give them some helpful information. So, in this relationship, you are the one in control and you have some degree of power or influence on this whole burnout situation. It is your responsibility as a manager to work with the administration, that higher leadership level, to address the areas that are creating burnout. What does that look like? What can you do? As a manager, be observant, perform an informal assessment of your staff. How are they doing? If you received a link to this webinar and you're in the GLAM field, your staff are not doing well. Take a human first approach and center all analysis and decisions on the well-being of your staff. I do not want you to bring in the strategic plan. I do not want you to refer to HR policies when you're working on this. You need to center the staff and their needs first, and then change the HR policies, update the organizational priorities because it needs to be human first. Next, I want you to advocate for realistic workloads and more resources. So I want you to communicate up what is or is not going to happen because what is or is not realistic. And I want you to communicate up what resources you need in order to make all the other things happen. And I want you to communicate down to your staff what is reasonable and help them with forming what is reasonable and how they can be successful with a reasonable workload. Next, I do not want you to perpetuate unrealistic expectations, workloads, or other toxic behaviors that manipulate or gaslight employees into sacrificing more of themselves for the greater good. For examples, you can refer earlier to this webinar, but essentially, you cannot be the one making and doing and affecting this toxic behavior. So knock it off. Next, set your staff up for success by providing regular, constructive, and positive feedback. Like, it doesn't have to be positive all the time, but if it's not, it needs to be constructive. And when it's constructive, what that looks like is actual specific requests, advice, or examples of what is successful. It's not just a critique or criticism with no ability or no detail on how the worker can be successful. Also, as much as constructive criticism can help your employees become better, so can positive reinforcement and affirmation of what they are doing correct and successfully. So please use both. To continue, Help staff find the ways that they work best and actively support them in areas where they are struggling with tangible solutions and better resources. So, if there are areas where your staff are struggling, where there's a bit of a gap in expertise or skill, whatever it is, help them on an individual basis because everybody is going to be different in what works for their brains. Next, prevent any shit from hitting staff to the fullest extent possible. That is your job. That is why you are being paid more to some extent. And none of this should be hitting your staff in any impactful way. If there is something that needs to change at the staff level, that is something that you can provide in a constructive fashion. And none of this should be hitting them directly. Recognize that you are the one that sets the tone for the team on what is or is not tolerated, and you need to adopt a zero tolerance policy for any toxic behavior, both within and toward your staff. That is your responsibility. Also, push for meaningful policy creation or change that centers the staff's well-being. You are in a position of power and influence. You are the only one who can advocate for that effectively for your staff. Which, of course, advocate for reasonable accommodations, better pay, better benefits, better anything for your staff. That is the other part of your job, is to help make sure that your staff are set up for success, that they're being treated and compensated well, and that they're doing well as human beings. That is your job. So, if we were to boil this down, and as you go through this work as a manager, it boils down to two questions. One, what structural, so organizational change, can you make? Two, how can you take better care of your people? And to wrap us up and get us into conclusion territory, remember, you can love and hate your work simultaneously. It is confusing, but it is real, and most of us feel it. And it can make it hard to leave abusive situations. And rest assured that abusive situations are not only something that exists in our personal lives and dynamics, they can also exist in work areas, situations, and dynamics. Also, you only have control over yourself, how you react, and what you choose to tolerate or put up with. So, can't necessarily be a hero and save everyone. You can't sacrifice yourself to the nth degree. You only have that personal autonomy. And last, change has to occur at the organizational level with the full participation of leadership and HR. Unfortunately, GLAMs, changing a toxic situation for the better is a rare occurrence. All right, a couple of resources here. We mentioned the Mayo Clinic and the Henry Ford Health Organization for some both statistical and therapeutic advice, though with the caveat that it's not exactly holistic or focused on where burnout is actually originating from and who can fix it. And then there is Solving Museum Worker Burnout and the Immorality of Inaction, which has an extensive amount of research and data that is coming both from the GLAM world as well as the larger economic and psychological fields. So if you want to do a little bit of a deeper dive with more resources, this particular post is a great amalgamation of that kind of information. For resources related that talk about some of these, both physical and mental well-being, there's the Ask Me Anything Career Edition webinar, How Much Am I Worth webinar, and the updated edition. And most especially the Hello Imposter webinar. For questions and connections, you can reach me on consulting@rachelchristine.com. If we've not already connected on LinkedIn, you are invited to do so. And then if you're not already on the newsletter for these webinars, you can sign up if you wish, and any future webinar offerings go to my newsletter community first before they're shared with anybody else. So just a little bit of a benefit there. And finally, questions. If you're watching this in premiere mode, we're going to spend a couple more minutes wrapping up questions in the chat box. And if you are watching this after the premiere, you are welcome to send me an email, consulting@rachelchristine.com. And with that, just thank you so much for attending. Thank you for your thoughtful questions and sharing your stories thus far on this particular topic. And I really do wish you good health in this next year and that you find your way out of burnout. Take care.